Story 1. The Pale Wanderer. The summer of 2019 was unusually warm in the Burgundy region of France, where I was spending my gap year working at a small vineyard. At 19, I thought I had life figured out, but that night in late July taught me there are things in this world that defy explanation. My friend Mark and I had developed a routine during those sweltering nights. When the heat became unbearable in our shared apartment above the village bakery, we'd take his old Peugeot and drive the countryside roads that snaked through the endless vineyards and wheat fields. These weren't tourist routes, just narrow ribbons of cracked asphalt that connected forgotten hamlets, the kind of roads where you might see one car every hour if you were unlucky. That particular night, we'd been driving for about an hour, windows rolled down, letting the slightly cooler night air wash over us. The radio crackled with static between stations, playing fragments of late-night talk shows and distant music. We were discussing Mark's complicated relationship with his ex-girlfriend when it happened. The road we were on was particularly isolated, cutting straight through two massive fields of sunflowers that stretched to the horizon. No streetlights, no houses visible, just our headlights carving a tunnel through the absolute darkness. The nearest village was at least 5 kilometers behind us, and we hadn't seen another car for 20 minutes. Mark was driving slowly, maybe 50 kilometers per hour, when suddenly his foot slammed on the brake pedal. The car lurched to a stop so abruptly that I was thrown forward against my seatbelt. "Merde," he whispered under his breath, but not in anger, in something closer to awe or terror. There, illuminated in our headlights like an actor stepping onto a stage, was a man crossing the road. But calling him simply a man feels inadequate for what we witnessed. He had emerged from the sunflower field on our left, moving with an otherworldly deliberateness toward the field on our right, completely unaware or unconcerned with our presence. He was entirely naked, his skin an unsettling pale beige that seemed to absorb our headlights rather than reflect them. It was the color of old parchment or bone left too long in the sun. But what made my stomach clench with unease wasn't his nudity. It was the way he moved. Have you ever watched someone sleepwalk? There's something profoundly unsettling about the way sleepwalkers move, as if they're being guided by something other than conscious thought. This man's movement was similar, but worse. Each step seemed to require tremendous effort, as if he was walking through invisible molasses. His legs moved in slow, deliberate arcs, his feet barely lifting off the asphalt. His arms hung completely limp at his sides, swaying slightly with each labored step. His head was tilted forward at an unnatural angle, chin nearly touching his chest, dark hair hanging like a curtain over his face. Throughout the entire crossing, which must have taken 30 or 40 seconds, he never once looked in our direction. Our headlights were blazing, the engine was running, and we were sitting no more than 10 meters away, yet he showed no acknowledgement of our existence whatsoever. The most disturbing part was the complete absence of any normal human behavior. He didn't hurry across the road as anyone would when caught in headlights. He didn't shield his eyes from the bright lights. He didn't even seem to register that he was on a road at all. He simply continued his strange floating progression from one field to the other, as if following some predetermined path that existed outside our reality. Mark and I sat in stunned silence, watching this impossible figure disappear into the sunflowers on the right side of the road. The stalks seemed to part around him without any visible disturbance, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, as if he had never existed at all. "Did you see that?" he whispered in French, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. I could only nod. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I felt a deep, primitive fear settling in my chest. The kind of fear that comes from witnessing something that your brain simply can't categorize or explain. Mark accelerated slowly, and we drove in complete silence for the next 10 minutes until we reached the main road that would take us back to the village. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen until we were safely parked outside our building, but even then, we could barely find words for it. The next afternoon, curiosity got the better of us. We drove back to the same stretch of road, easily identifiable by a gnarled oak tree that had been struck by lightning years earlier. In daylight, the area looked completely ordinary. 2 vast fields of sunflowers on either side of a straight country road, with no buildings or structures visible in any direction. We parked and walked into both fields, looking for any kind of path or trail that might explain the man's presence. There was nothing. The sunflower plants grew in perfectly straight rows, with narrow walking spaces between them. But there were no footprints, no broken stalks, no indication that anyone had passed through recently. More puzzling still, we realized there was nowhere he could have come from. The nearest farmhouse was more than 2 kilometers away, hidden behind a hill. The nearest village was 5 kilometers back the way we'd come. There were no side roads, no paths, no logical explanation for why anyone would be walking naked through sunflower fields at 2 in the morning. I've thought about that night countless times over the past few years. I've tried to rationalize what we saw. Perhaps it was someone having a mental health crisis or someone under the influence of drugs. But those explanations don't account for the otherworldly quality of his movement, the way he seemed to glide rather than walk, or the complete absence of any normal human responses. Mark returned to university that fall, and I finished my year at the vineyard before moving back to England. We still keep in touch, and occasionally one of us will bring up the pale man, as we've come to call him. Neither of us has ever come up with a satisfactory explanation. Sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I wonder if he's still out there, following his mysterious path through the French countryside. I wonder how many other drivers have glimpsed him in their headlights, and whether they, like us, drove home in stunned silence, forever changed by an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. The rational part of my mind insists there must be a logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw that night was not entirely of this world. Story 2: The Watchers in the Woods. Family reunions at Cascade Lake had been a tradition in my husband's family for over 2 decades. Every August, we'd pack up our gear and drive 3 hours into the Cascade National Forest, where his parents had reserved the same cluster of campsites for what seemed like half a lifetime. It was the kind of wholesome family gathering that looked perfect in photos. 3 generations roasting marshmallows, kids splashing in the lake, adults sharing stories around the campfire until the embers died down. This particular year, 2018, was especially significant because it was our first reunion with both of our children. Our daughter Emma had just turned 3 and was excited about sleeping in the big trailer with Grandma and Grandpa. Our son Jake was only 8 months old, still in that stage where he slept deeply and woke up happy. We decided to keep him in our tent with us, partly for convenience and partly because the August nights could get surprisingly cold at that elevation. The campground was unusually full that weekend. Every site was occupied, creating a small temporary community of families, couples, and groups of friends who'd come to escape the heat of the valley below. During the day, the place buzzed with activity. Children running between campsites, the smell of grills and campfires, laughter echoing off the surrounding pine trees. But at night, the forest reclaimed its territory. The chatter and movement would fade by 10 o'clock, leaving only the sound of the lake lapping against the rocky shore and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. On the second night, I woke with that sudden, jarring awareness that comes from a full bladder and the realization that you're in the middle of nowhere with only two options: make the trek to the outhouse or find a discreet spot outside your tent. The outhouse was a good 3-minute walk through the dark campground, past other families' tents, and around the loop road. In my half-asleep state, with Jake sleeping peacefully beside me, the choice seemed obvious. I slipped on my shoes and grabbed the small camping lantern we kept by the tent entrance. The moon was up, but hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting everything in varying shades of black and dark gray. I could make out the silhouettes of the surrounding pine trees and the gentle glow from our neighbors' tents, but details were lost in the darkness. I found a spot about 20 feet from our tent, behind a cluster of young firs that provided adequate privacy. The forest was absolutely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, just the kind of deep quiet that only exists far from civilization. As I finished my business and began to adjust my clothing, something shifted in my peripheral vision. It wasn't a distinct movement, more like a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness between the trees. I turned my head slightly, trying to focus on the spot where I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, something move. The darkness seemed to pulse and shift, but that could have been my eyes playing tricks in the poor light. Then I felt it, that primitive, instinctual warning that every human carries deep in their genetic memory, the feeling that you're being watched by something that might consider you prey. My heart rate spiked, and suddenly I was desperate to get back to the tent, to the illusion of safety that thin nylon walls could provide. I walked quickly but quietly back to our campsite, trying not to appear panicked while every nerve ending in my body screamed at me to run. As I unzipped the tent entrance, Jake began to stir, making the soft whimpering sounds that indicated he'd be awake soon. The familiar routine of preparing his bottle helped calm my nerves. I mixed the formula by the soft light of the camping lantern, tested the temperature on my wrist, and settled him back into his sleeping bag. Within minutes, he was asleep again, and I turned off the light. That's when the real terror began. In the complete darkness of the tent, my other senses seemed to sharpen. I could hear my own breathing, my husband's steady sleep breathing beside me, and Jake's tiny snores. But underneath those familiar sounds, I began to detect something else. The soft crunch of pine needles and dried leaves being compressed under careful footsteps. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just another camper making a late-night bathroom trip. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too quiet. Someone was trying very hard not to be heard, and they were circling our campsite. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sounds moved from the side of our tent where Jake was sleeping, past the front entrance, and around to my side. The footsteps would pause for long moments, then resume their careful circuit. Through the thin tent material, I could see shadows moving, large human-shaped shadows that blocked out the faint ambient light from neighboring campsites. There were at least 3 distinct figures, maybe more. They moved independently, but seemed to be coordinating their movements, taking turns approaching different parts of our campsite while the others waited in the tree line. The pattern continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The most unsettling part was their patience. These weren't drunk campers stumbling around in the dark or teenagers playing pranks. The movements were too controlled, too purposeful. They were studying us, watching us, for reasons I couldn't begin to imagine. Eventually, the shadows stopped moving, and the footsteps faded. I lay awake until dawn, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any indication that they had returned. Jake woke at his usual time, around 7, and refused to go back to sleep. I was actually grateful for his early wake-up call. I needed the comfort of daylight and normal activities. I made coffee on our camp stove and sat outside the tent, letting the morning sun warm my face while Jake played with his favorite toy. My sister-in-law Rebecca emerged from her tent about an hour later, looking as tired as I felt. Her family was camped about 40 feet away on the other side of my in-laws' RV. "Rough night?" I asked as she approached with her own cup of coffee. She nodded grimly. "You could say that. I got up to pee around 2:15 and couldn't make it to the outhouse, so I went outside our tent. When I came back in, Rusty started acting really weird." Rusty was their golden retriever, normally the most laid-back dog imaginable. He spent most of his time at the lake swimming or napping in the shade. "He started pacing around the tent," Rebecca continued, sniffing at the ground and whining under his breath. "I thought maybe he needed to go out too, but when I opened the tent flap, he started growling. Not barking, just this low, continuous growl, like he does when he sees a coyote or something." My stomach dropped. What time was this? Around 2:30, maybe 2:45. That's when I started hearing noises outside, like someone walking around our campsite, but trying to be quiet about it. I woke up David, and we both listened. It sounded like a big animal at first, but the footsteps were too regular, too human. I told her about my own experience with the shadows, and we compared the timing. It matched perfectly. Whatever had been prowling around my tent had moved on to hers, continuing their nocturnal surveillance of our family's campsites. "The weird thing is," Rebecca added, "nothing was disturbed this morning. Our food was still sealed up in the bear boxes. All our gear was exactly where we left it. But there are definitely footprints in the dirt around our tent. Boot prints, not paw prints." We walked over to examine the evidence. Sure enough, there were clear impressions in the sandy soil around her campsite, the unmistakable tread pattern of hiking boots or work boots. But more disturbing were the shoe prints I found around our own tent later that morning. They were different from the boot prints at Rebecca's site, indicating at least 2 different people had been moving through our camp. The prints led from the forest, circled both our tents, and returned to the tree line. Some of them were uncomfortably close to the side of our tent where Jake had been sleeping. Rebecca and I decided to ask around the campground, casually inquiring whether anyone else had experienced anything unusual during the night. Most people just shook their heads, but an elderly man from a site near the lake mentioned that his dog had been restless all night, barking at something in the woods until he'd finally brought the animal inside their RV. The final piece of the puzzle came from my Aunt Martha, who had rented a cabin on a dirt road about a quarter-mile from the main campground. She'd arrived Friday evening around 6:30, and while unloading her truck, she'd been approached by a woman in a beat-up sedan. She looked like she'd been living rough, Martha told us. Dirty clothes, stringy hair, that look that people get when they've been using drugs for a while. She asked if she'd seen some guy, never gave me his name, just said, "Have you seen him?" When I said no, she wanted to know if we were staying in the cabin for the weekend. When Martha confirmed that she'd rented it through Sunday, the woman had become agitated, almost angry. She'd made some comment about people always taking what doesn't belong to them before turning around and speeding back down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust. Looking back now, I believe that woman and at least one companion, possibly the man she was looking for, had been living rough in the forest around the lake. Our family reunion. Story 3: The Man in Blue. Being a counselor in training at Camp Wildwood was supposed to be the best summer of my life. At 16, I was old enough to have real responsibilities, but young enough that the camp administrators looked the other way when we bent a few rules. The camping trip into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was legendary among the older staff. 3 days in the wilderness where the counselors in training got to experience what it was like to be truly independent, away from the watchful eyes of the camp directors. What I didn't anticipate was that those mountains held secrets darker than anything I could have imagined. Our group consisted of 32 people, 4 full counselors, 4 of us counselors in training, and 24 campers between the ages of 13 and 15. We'd set out early Monday morning, loaded down with backpacks and sleeping bags, following a network of trails that would take us deep into the national forest where we'd establish base camp for 2 nights. The hike started well enough. The kids were excited, chattering constantly, and taking pictures with disposable cameras. The trail was well maintained, winding through dense groves of aspen and pine, with occasional clearings that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. I was bringing up the rear of our long single-file line with my fellow counselor in training, Jordan, along with 2 campers, Mike and Sarah, who were struggling with the altitude and the weight of their packs. The main group had disappeared around a bend maybe 50 yards ahead, but we weren't concerned. We knew the trail, and the plan was to meet at a predetermined campsite that evening. What we didn't expect was to lose the trail entirely. After about 3 hours of hiking, we'd entered a section of forest that looked different from everything we'd passed through earlier. The trees here were mostly dead, victims of either wildfire or beetle kill, I couldn't tell which. Blackened trunks rose like charcoal pillars toward the sky, creating an eerily beautiful but unsettling landscape. In the middle of this dead forest sat a small log cabin. It was the kind of structure you might see in old Western movies: rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, a covered porch with a single wooden chair. But unlike everything else in the area, the cabin appeared to be completely untouched by whatever disaster had killed the surrounding trees. The logs still held their natural color, the roof looked solid, and there were even curtains visible in the windows. "That's weird," Sarah said, stopping to stare at the structure. "Why isn't that burned?" Before any of us could answer, Mike let out a sharp yelp and pointed behind us. We spun around to see a man, maybe 20 feet back down the trail, walking slowly in our direction. He appeared to be in his 40s or 50s, with long black hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he carried no visible supplies, no backpack, no water bottle, nothing that would suggest he was a legitimate hiker. But what made my skin crawl was the way he was looking at us. His eyes were locked onto our group with an intensity that felt almost predatory. He wasn't looking around at the scenery or watching his footing on the rocky trail. He was studying us. Jordan, showing more courage than I felt, raised his hand in a friendly wave. "Hey there," he called out. The man didn't return the greeting, but he mumbled something that we couldn't quite hear. Jordan, either braver or more foolish than the rest of us, actually walked a few steps closer and asked the man to repeat himself. This time, the man's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "Going camping?" "Yeah," Jordan replied, trying to sound casual. "Do you know these trails pretty well?" The man's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Better be careful," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of threat. That's when every instinct I had started screaming at me to get away from this person. I grabbed Jordan's arm and suggested loudly that we should catch up with the rest of the group. Mike and Sarah needed no encouragement. They were already walking quickly up the trail. As we hurried away, I glanced back several times. The man had stopped walking and was standing in the middle of the trail, watching us go. He made no attempt to follow, but his eyes never left us until we disappeared around a curve. We found the main group about 30 minutes later, and when we told the adult counselors about our encounter, they seemed unconcerned. "Probably just a local," one of them said. "Lots of folks live up here year-round. He was probably just curious about what a bunch of kids were doing in his neighborhood." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something fundamentally wrong about that man.
The way he'd appeared so suddenly, the absence of any hiking gear, the threatening tone of his voice, none of it felt normal or innocent. We made camp that evening in a large clearing beside a stream, and despite my lingering unease, I managed to enjoy the evening. After the younger campers had gone to bed, Jordan and the other 2 counselors in training brought out alcohol they'd smuggled from the staff quarters. I contributed a joint I'd been saving for exactly this occasion. To avoid getting caught, we decided to walk down to the stream where we could smoke and drink without being seen from the main camp. The spot we chose was maybe 100 yards from the tents, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough that we could get back quickly if needed. The 4 of us sat on fallen logs beside the water, passing around a bottle of vodka and sharing the joint while telling increasingly ridiculous ghost stories. The alcohol and marijuana, combined with the thin air at that altitude, had me feeling more relaxed than I had all day, and for a while I forgot about the strange man we'd encountered on the trail. It was around midnight when things started to go wrong. Jordan was in the middle of a rambling story about a haunted dormitory at his boarding school when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. In the silence that followed, we could all hear it, the sound of footsteps moving through the forest near our camp. At first, we assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to use the bathroom, but as we listened more carefully, it became clear that whoever was out there wasn't following any of the established paths between tents. The footsteps were irregular, circling through the trees around the perimeter of our campsite. "Should we go check it out?" whispered Amy, one of the other counselors in training. Before anyone could answer, the footsteps stopped. We waited in tense silence for several minutes, straining to hear any other sounds, but the forest had gone completely quiet. Spooked by the incident and feeling suddenly very drunk, we decided to call it a night. Jordan walked with me to my tent, which I was sharing with Amy. In our altered state, we ended up making out for a few minutes before he went back to the boys' tent on the other side of camp. I fell asleep almost immediately, but something woke me in the early hours of the morning. My internal clock suggested it was probably around 3 or 4 a.m., and the tent was pitch black. I lay still for a moment, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Someone was walking slowly around the outside of my tent, close enough that I could hear the soft crunch of pine needles under their feet. The sound was methodical, deliberate, not the hurried shuffle of someone trying to use the bathroom in the dark, but the careful pace of someone who is taking their time to examine something. My first thought was that it was Jordan, maybe coming back for another late-night visit, but as I turned to look for him in the darkness, I felt a body beside me in the sleeping bag. He was already there, breathing deeply in sleep. The footsteps continued their circuit around the tent. Through the thin nylon material, I could see the shadow of someone moving past the front entrance, then along the sidewall where I was lying. Whoever it was stopped several times, as if they were listening or looking for something. I was torn between fear and confusion. If Jordan was sleeping beside me, who was outside? One of the other counselors in training checking on us? An adult counselor making rounds? But something about the movements felt wrong. The person outside was being too careful, too stealthy. If it was someone from our group, why weren't they using a flashlight? Why weren't they calling out softly to let us know who they were? After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away from our tent, and I heard the soft sound of the tent zipper being opened. The person beside me shifted slightly, and I felt an arm wrap around me from behind. "Jordan?" I whispered. Came a drowsy response, and I felt him pull me closer. I must have dozed off because the next thing I was aware of was the urgent need to pee. I whispered to Jordan that I had to go to the bathroom, and he mumbled something unintelligible and rolled over, pulling his hoodie up over his head. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and slipped outside. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, providing enough light to navigate safely to the designated bathroom area about 50 yards from camp. I had just finished and was starting back toward the tents when I heard a commotion coming from the direction of our campsite. It sounded like someone going through our supplies, opening and closing containers, maybe looking for food. In my haste to get back and see what was happening, I lost my footing and grabbed for a branch to steady myself. The branch broke with a loud crack that echoed through the quiet forest. Almost immediately, a bright flashlight beam hit me directly in the eyes, blinding me completely. I couldn't see who was holding it, but the light was definitely coming from the direction of our camp, and it was moving toward me. "Sorry, it's just me," I heard Jordan's voice call out softly. I felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by confusion when he asked, "Have you seen my blue hoodie?" "What are you talking about?" I managed to stammer. "You were just wearing it when you came back to the tent." There was a long pause before Jordan said something that made my blood turn to ice.